So one of the things that's been put out by certain individuals connected to this case for quite some time has been the idea that the case is probably never going to be solved because look how long it's been. Recently, the alcoholic ostrich on one of his live streams came up with a different theory as to why we haven't seen any sort of resolution in this case yet. And that's what I'm going to discuss in this video. So this is the third video in a series that I've just been doing, which is debunking things that have been stated by the alcoholic ostrich. Because I've noticed that when someone like that is putting out misinformation, that misinformation seems to spread faster than the truth. And not only that, it seems to stick for longer. And of course, in a case like this, where so many people have become emotionally invested, then when people are putting out misinformation, it can be upsetting for people, it can be discouraging for people, and it can be frustrating for people. So that's why I make a point of explaining the truth when things are being put out that aren't quite right. If you missed my last two videos, then I will add the link for them in the description section for this video. And I'll do my best to remember to also add a link on the end screen for this video. Before I start, I do want to once again give a shout out and thank you to those people who've been doing Buy Me a Coffee and who've been doing super thanks. I greatly appreciate your support. So with that said, let's jump into this video.
The Global previously reported that of troubling issues inside of Jack and Lily's home, including admitted drug abuse by the stepfather, multiple black eyes on the children, controlling behavior that affected their mother, and other pressures brought on by the parents' financial struggles. The Globe's reporting also revealed that a provisional child protective I can't read this, too far away from you guys, had visited the children's home and investigated a report of suspected abuse or neglect. Staff Sergeant McMahon said police interviewed the social worker involved in Jack and Lily and others with valuable information about the children's circumstances. We've looked into their movements and the days prior and the kind of things that were going on in their lives as part of our investigation query. All right, so when do you think they did that? When do you think RCMP looked into this? When do you think RCMP spoke with Child Protective Services? Do you think that happened after July, after they've already investigated them? Or do you think that was part of their investigation, as he just said? So the problem, I can already see the problem here is that a lot of people are looking at this and probably thinking that this is information that is happening today, that they spoke to the RCMP social worker last week, and this is the information that they got. That is 100%. I mean, if you can't figure this out or deduce this, you probably shouldn't be trying. But when, you have to ask yourself, when did RCMP reach out to the social worker and do this? If Daniel and Malaya are suspect number one, which I truly believe they are, because, hey, you don't go through a person's financial records, their phone, give them a lie detector test and continually interrogate them if you don't believe they're a suspect. And so if you have something like this and he says that they made contact with them and they talked to him about the situation, when do you think that happened? Let me know in the comment section. Put it there. When do you think? Do you think that's a recent activity? You think that just happened?
Honestly, this guy should be a politician. He's really good at glossing over things. So you'll note he started reading through, and after he mentioned that they had been investigated due to reports of suspected abuse or neglect, you get a long pause. He's trying to process how he can talk about that to basically deflect that bit of information. Seems like this guy is determined to stay in support of Daniel no matter what. And he's determined to ignore anything that is going to basically throw his theory out of the water. His theory, of course, being this notion that the children walked beyond the area of the search zone. And that's what happened to them. But you get this long pause as if he's trying to figure out what to say about that, how to deflect from that. Clearly he couldn't think of anything because he just continued reading after that. So he goes on and he's reading about how they did interviews with a social worker and others about the children's circumstances, which apparently was long enough for him to figure out his plan of attack, because then he asks his audience, now, when do you think that happened? When do you think the RCMP looked into this? When do you think they spoke to the CPS? What he's trying to sell here is the notion that all this happened before the documents were released in August. Although he keeps saying July, because he's not very good at checking his facts. And he says, do you think that happened after July, meaning August, after they've already investigated them? Or do you think that was part of their investigation, as he just said? So what he's trying to tell us here, what he's trying to convince his audience, is that they investigated Malaya and Daniel prior to when the documents were released in August, and then after that, the investigation was over. They were investigated. There was no more need to investigate them. They were cleared, which is ludicrous. And then he's saying, people are thinking this info, that this happened today, that they spoke to the social worker last week. And of course he adds to that, if you can't figure this out or deduce this, you probably shouldn't be trying. Or I would like to put that advice back on him, because I'm going to come back to this in just a moment, but again, he's showing his ignorance here. He then tries to say, he talks about, well, obviously they were a suspect. But instead of saying were past tense, he says, if Daniel and Malaya are suspect number one, which I truly believe, well, yes, they still are. Not were, but they still are. And he talks about the financial records and the phones being taken and the polygraph examinations and the many interrogations. So if you don't believe they're a suspect, so I don't know what he's trying to do here. Because on one hand, he's been pushing really, really hard with this whole they wandered off theory. And nobody else has said that they do not believe Malaya and Daniel are suspects. Nobody said that they didn't believe in the past that they were suspects. But now he's trying to push, well, obviously they were suspects in the beginning. And if you don't believe that, well, you know, you're a fool. Nobody has said that they don't believe Daniel and Malaya are suspects, other than this Turkey guy who's trying to push now that they've been cleared. So after saying that, he asks his audience again, do you think that it's a recent activity? Do you think it just happened? So he is gaslighting his own audience here. He wants validation for his theory. But to get that validation, he's essentially gaslighting his audience and saying, if you don't agree with me, you're a bunch of morons. So of course, now I haven't looked at the chat here, but I'm willing to bet that the chat was full of people going, yeah, we agree with you. Because he has basically told them that he's ridiculing them if they are going to believe anything different. His wording, his tone of voice, everything here is basically telling his audience, if you don't agree with me, you're stupid. So the answer you have to give has to agree with mine. And that will give me validation and tell me that I am correct. Now, first of all, let's talk about what he's saying here. When were these interviews done? Brian Ward, the bus driver, was interviewed May the 2nd and May the 14th. Nancy Gallant, the children's teacher, was interviewed on May the 3rd. This information is readily available in the documents, so most people know this for a fact. As for all the CPS stuff, well, the article that he is referring to, which he clearly hasn't read, was published on the 19th of June. So yes, CPS were interviewed before all these documents were released. Apparently, because he's only been covering this case for a month or so, he doesn't know this information. So he's gaslighting his audience and saying, well, this has got to have been done before the documents were released. So what is his point here? He told us what his point was. He believes that at the time the documents were released, that the investigation into Malaya and Daniel was finished. So essentially what he's trying to tell his audience is that if these interviews were done before the documents were released, then they were part of the investigation, and since then Daniel and Malaya have been cleared, so it's all irrelevant. So he's trying to say that the CPS stuff, the interviews with many people, and I know it's more than just Brian Ward and Nancy Gallant, he's trying to say these things don't have an impact on the case. Then they're not relevant, because the documents say they didn't believe it was a criminal investigation. Now, I've discussed this a million times. It's in italics. It is a comment by the person writing the documents. Her role is in a legal capacity, meaning that she does not know the inner workings of the case. She only knows what she needs to know to create those applications. Not only that, but in those applications, she has to soften it. Because if she puts in an application to the judge where every other paragraph suggests that these parents are criminally liable for whatever happened to their children, the judge is going to send that records request back and say, this is a criminal investigation, you need to actually put in a request for a warrant. And then all of a sudden there's going to be a heck of a lot more work involved. So of course she's going to be very careful in the writing of that document to make sure that there's nothing in that document that indicates to the judge that they believe it to be a criminal investigation, because otherwise they're not going to get their records request. And they're going to have to start investigating it openly as a criminal investigation, losing all the benefits that come with investigating it under the Missing Persons Act. But what this turkey guy is saying, this all goes back to his argument that he was making earlier in his video, which I spoke about in one of my previous videos, where he was trying to argue that, well, if it was criminal, they would have arrested them by now. If it was criminal, what could they possibly have found out since the documents in August? Because we haven't heard anything. And I explained the multitude of things that can change in that period of time. That is a really long time. Particularly given that when you look at the dating on the documents, they all date back to July. So 6 months has passed since those documents were created. I've explained before, investigations are complex. You're building on to what you already know. So you find out a bit of information that leads to more tasks, that leads to more interviews, that leads to more records access requests, may lead to more forensics. And of course, in terms of forensics, July is way too early for a majority of the forensic stuff to have come back. We know from, now I can't remember if it was an article or in one of the emails that I had, but they only recently, in the last couple of months, got the forensic results back for the blanket. In terms of the phones, the amount of data that comes from a download of a phone is phenomenal. And it's not just all laid out so you can sit and read it with nice little subheadings and headings and all this sort of stuff. You need an analyst to go through it and understand it. And then they have to write a report. Likewise, if they did manage to get telematics on either of their cars, on Malaya's car, or whatever the car was that Daniel had at the time, if they even located that car, again, that is something that takes an analysis from a specialist before you can put all the information out there. You saw in the letter that I shared a month or so back where they mentioned that they'd had something like 1,040 tips, and those tips had generated over 1,300 tasks. So there's a snowball effect. One tip may lead to multiple tasks, which then may lead to further investigation. Based on the information from CPS, from the bus driver, from the teacher, there would have been more interviews that happened after that. We know they interviewed Daniel's children. They did a forensic interview with them. They probably interviewed his ex-wife. So that probably snowballed out to a request for medical records for Daniel's older children, if there was any past history of anything with them. And yet this Turkey guy somehow thinks that because the documents were released in October and August, that they were released because the investigation was finished. Or he thinks the investigation is finished because of the comment by the person writing the actual records request, where she said at this point in time, we don't think it is criminal in nature or something like that, which I've explained so many times, and if you don't get it, I'm not going to waste my breath. So yes, all those interviews relating to the children's welfare were done before the documents were released. But that doesn't mean they're not relevant to the case, and I'm going to come back to that.
You guys are being a problem. Huge problem, man. But they're doing it for the kids. That's what they claim. You're doing it for yourself.
Again, trying to gaslight other content creators. And while I'm not saying that this guy is a narcissist, this is another classic narcissist move, where basically you turn around something that's been directed at you and accuse the other person of being guilty of that. So I suspect that people have said that he's not doing it for the right reasons. So what is he doing? He's putting it back on the other content creators and saying that's them. They're not doing it for the right reasons. My response to that is, look at these faces. How could you not want to fight for the sake of these children? How could you not want for them to be found and for justice to be served? I guess if you don't show pictures of them on your channel at all, then you probably don't have to look at them. You don't have to have those feelings. You don't have to feel that you're fighting for a good reason.
Staff Sergeant McCannon said that he understands the urgent need for answers about what happened with Jack and Lily, but cautioned that intensive major crime investigators take time to do things by the book. And according to the Canadian Chapter of Rights and Freedoms, we have to consider whether charges will be laid eventually. So we have to maintain the rule of law and follow the rules that are there. It does take time, and it is going to take some more time, he said. Does it take time? I mean, this is a pretty big hint. You know what I mean? If you have your suspect, does it really take that much time? I mean, you know, you look at Ashley Buzzard, she got arrested within a few weeks. You look at the Harrows, they got arrested within a few weeks. Like, you know, once they've got their suspect in mind, because you have to understand, again, this is looking at the evidence past its face value. All right. So if you look at the evidence past its face value, if the parents did something, let's play this out. A parent involved incident is usually a crime that occurred in the moment, meaning there was an accident, a parent lost control due to rage or drunk or drugs or those type of things. It's not premeditated. There's not a lot of planning, meaning there's a lot of mistakes, a lot of evidence left behind. Those type of things. It's not like you can, they're making sure there's all these things crossed and dotted, right? So in those moments, once you have your suspect in mind, it's not hard, especially if it's very close to the time of the crime. Now, if it's a cold case, you're going to come into some hurdles. You know, we spoke about this last night on the covering Brian Koberger case, where had they found his name a lot later, there may have been information that was going to be deleted or cameras that would have been rewritten over and things of that nature. And so you're gonna come across some problems. But if you have your suspect right away and you know who that person is, you know, it doesn't take very much to build a case.
You know, I think this guy needs to go back to doing stories about UFOs and conspiracies, because he's really struggling here. He talks about Rob McCammon saying that basically these intensive major crime investigations take time because they have to do things by the book. They've got to take into consideration the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And he says, we have to consider whether charges will be laid eventually. So we have to maintain the rule of law and follow the rules that are there. Now, the turkey guy read that wrong. He said it's considered whether charges will be laid eventually, which doesn't even make sense. But Rob McCammon has just outlined it pretty damn clearly there. He has labelled it a major crime investigation. He's saying that they have to make sure they get it right because they don't want it to be thrown out of court. They don't want any technicalities. Because when it comes to cases like this, the first thing the defence does is go through every document with a fine-tooth comb, go through every interview with a fine-tooth comb, go through every action of the RCMP with a fine-tooth comb, and look for areas where they can create motions for the court and say this wasn't done properly, so this evidence has to be thrown out. You just have to look at the Madeline Soto case, where the defence tried to have all the evidence from Stearns' phone thrown out, claiming that it was taken illegally. That would have been a major blow for the prosecution. Thankfully, they were able to prove that, in fact, they had just cause. He couldn't have spelled it out more clearly. It is a criminal investigation, and they are taking their time because they have to cross their T's and dot their I's so that when arrests are made, they stick. So what is the argument from this turkey guy? Oh, well, you know, does it take time? I mean, this is a pretty big hint. And he claims that this means that, well, it's not an investigation, because if you have your suspect, does it really take that much time? And then he cites two cases as examples. But the problem is that these cases do not actually match this case in any way. So first of all, he talks about Ashley Buzzard. Well, they arrested her within weeks. Actually, it wasn't within weeks. It was a couple of months. They arrested her because a couple of tourists stumbled on Melody's remains. And because they had Melody's remains, all of a sudden they had all this evidence, all this forensic evidence that linked Ashley directly to what happened to her daughter. Had Melody not been discovered, they would still be working this investigation, still be trying to build a strong enough case from circumstantial evidence. Let's talk about Emmanuel Haros. First of all, he was 7 months old, so it's not like they could have claimed that he wandered away. And the claim that the mother was hit over the head in a car park and he was abducted. Well, that's a pretty dumb claim to make, because the first thing investigators would have done would have been to access every single bit of CCTV footage within a radius of the location where she claimed for it to have happened. Straight away, there would have been nothing on that footage, meaning that gave them more than enough circumstantial evidence to really start digging and requesting warrants. So straight away, investigators were able to prove that what she claimed happened never occurred, which meant they were able to start putting pressure on. They were able to get warrants from the court, and they were able to make arrests. Yes, to date his remains have not been found, but they made a major screw up by claiming this thing to have happened in a shopping centre car park. Because of course the first thing that's going to happen is they're going to look for financial records, they're going to look for phone records, they're going to look for CCTV records. And straight away they're going to be able to haul them in and say this never happened. Jack and Lily went missing from a rural location, an isolated property. There's no camera footage, there's no neighbours who can witness anything, visually at least. But I'm going to put a pin in that and come back to it. Now he makes this statement that you need to be looking at evidence past its face value. I'm not sure even he knows what he's talking about there. I think it's his way of justifying his interpretation of evidence. But to me, it makes no sense. He doesn't back it up with anything to explain what it is he's trying to say there. Now, he tries to go on and say that, when it comes to parents and them being involved with children not being alive, well, it's not premeditated, so there's going to be heaps of mistakes and heaps of evidence. There's no logic in that statement whatsoever. Just because something isn't premeditated doesn't mean that people can't get rid of the evidence. This is when you see delays with people reporting disappearances. Classic case, Chris Watts. He wasn't the one that reported his wife missing, it was her best friend. He tootled off to work. In that house, 3 people died. 4 if you count Nico, the baby that was unborn. And yet, you see in the footage, when law enforcement turned up, that the house looked normal. By the time Shanann and the children were reported missing, the house had been cleaned up and they had already been removed. But not only that, it is a gross presumption to believe that the RCMP don't have any evidence. They were questioning Malaya and Daniel on day 1. They had major crimes involved by day 2. And when you start to listen to the dispatch, you can hear a shift within less than 24 hours. They called off the search only 6 days after the children were reported missing. Now that would be pretty ballsy unless you had something solid to convince you that, yeah, this is going to become a criminal investigation. That to me suggests that they do have more evidence. Because, yes, Malaya and Daniel's stories didn't match up. But you would have to be pretty confident that that is the direction you are headed to call off a search for 2 missing children. So he goes on to say that, once you've got your suspect in mind, it's not hard, especially if it's close to the time of the crime. Like, oh, yeah, we think this is our suspect, so we're going to arrest him now. Like, oh my gosh. And I'm going to put a pin in that and come back to it, because that is just the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. There is so much work involved before you can make an arrest if you want to make it stick. And then he goes on to say, now, if it's a cold case, you're going to come into some hurdles. And he starts to talk about the Idaho case, saying, well, if they found Brian's name later, then there might have been information deleted or cameras rewritten over. Well, there's no way that case was ever going to become a cold case. I don't think he understands what a cold case is. A cold case is a case where they have worked every lead, where they have worked every bit of evidence, and they've got no more leads or anything to follow. There is no more tips coming in. There is no more tasks being created from the information they have. A cold case is a case where they've hit a brick wall and they're not going any further with that case at that point in time. Classic example of this, and this comes to mind because tomorrow is actually the 30th anniversary, that is the Amber Hagerman case. She was abducted on the 13th of January 1996. She was pulled off her bike and taken by a guy who threw her into his truck and disappeared with her. Her remains were found a number of days later in a culvert. They only have a very, very small amount of DNA. So they can't use that up until they know that the technology exists for them to get a result. They can't progress the case any further because they've had no more tips or anything like that. So that case is just sitting there waiting for improvements in DNA technology in the hopes that one day they can actually get that DNA match. But nothing is happening with that case. So yes, that is a cold case. In terms of Koberger saying that, well, information might have been deleted or cameras rewritten over. Yes, perhaps the telematics on his vehicle may have been written over had there been more time before they made the arrest. And it just dawned on me that's why he drove his car all the way back to his parents' place, because he was meant to fly out. And yet his father flew in and they drove his car cross country back to his parents' place. I bet you anything the logic behind that was to try and overwrite the telematics on his vehicle. This is a guy who was studying criminology. He probably understood that he needed to overwrite all the telematics on his car. But as for cameras being written over, they were getting camera footage anyway because of the crime. They got the camera footage before they had a suspect. That makes no sense. And, they didn't just find his name. They had a DNA match, which led them directly to him. But still, trying to say that had they taken a bit longer, that the Idaho 4 case would have been a cold case, it doesn't work that way. There is no way known that case would have ever become a cold case.
Kind of let's go back. Let me see what he said that kind of stood out. The one thing is the fact that they spoke to, the social services about the stuff that the Global Mail was indicating. They were reporting that it was about child abuse or neglect, and RCMP said we talked about them. Now, again, when did they talk to them about it? That's the important part. In the end, I think what they mean by resolved is I do think they're going to eventually find remains or some remnants of them in the woods. And they may never get the full answer because I don't know if they're going to be able to find, with given so many time, animal activity and things of that nature, they're probably going to find a partial, stuff. And so I think the term he used, resolved, is probably accurate versus solved. I think they put a lot of thought into that. And I think also in the one interview, and I don't have it with me, but there was another interview that I think they had it spoken, or it was like a formal interview where he'd spoken. And I think they also say that they don't have any evidence against Malaya and Daniel at this point. So here's the thing. If one of them did something, then they all did. And if that were true, they all would be running from RCMP to pin blame on the other to get leniency or immunity for themselves. Also, the perfect statement there too, Ron. If you're investigating this case, your goal is to separate your suspects because you don't want them to maintain a story. You don't want them to also tell each other, hey, maybe we need to get a lawyer and lawyer up. So you want to separate them. You want to make sure they don't talk, and you want to make sure that they don't communicate so that they don't, come up with the same story and things of that nature. Malaya and Daniel did that to themselves. Malaya left them, blocked them, separated themselves. And yet, with all that, they still can't figure out anything. It's like either the RCMP is like and it's not just RCMP, it's major crimes. It's a bunch of different departments within RCMP. They're either the most ignorant and unqualified persons in law enforcement, which I doubt, or maybe perhaps the investigation results, as much as you don't like them, are what the results are.
So he's trying to infer that, they spoke to social services and that's all done and dusted. He's like, we spoke to them. Like, no big deal, end of story. And then he goes back to this whole thing between solved and resolved, which is just a load of BS. Now, I covered this in the first of these three videos. He's claiming that because they say that they're confident the case will be resolved, that means that they're not going to actually solve it. It's just going to be that they're going to reach a point where, they've kind of mostly got the answers and, Honestly, I said this before, the reason they refer to it being aiming for a resolution or being confident that it will be resolved is because this is multifaceted. They need to find Lily and Jack, and they also need to make arrests and basically prosecute the case. So it's multifaceted. So resolved or coming to finding a resolution is far more appropriate than being solved. You're not solving a puzzle. This is a case that you are trying to bring a resolution to. You are trying to bring it to a point where you have achieved justice, where you have found the children. Everything in the article points to it being a criminal case. I mean, Rob McCammon even says that intensive major crime investigations take time. He has named it up. But of course, this Turkey guy just completely ignores that because that doesn't suit his narrative. So they're saying it's only going to be resolved as opposed to solved because he believes that they're just going to find partial remains because by the time they find them, scavengers will have spread their remains. so that they wouldn't have all the answers. Now, we know that's not going to be the case, but let's just go down that track for just one moment. If, hypothetically, they did suddenly discover that Lily and Jack went beyond the search zone and someone finds their remains, and let's say there had been scavengers in the area, what are they going to do? They're going to bring the dogs in, and they are going to find whatever they can. Well, if they found the remains and were therefore able to conclude that yes, the children did wander off, and they wandered off beyond the search zone somehow, and well, we missed that, but we found the remains, we can put them to rest. How is that not being solved? It is still solving the case. A resolution is bringing a number of things to an end. I mean, has this guy even looked at any of the details of this case? Or has he just stuck his head in the sand and ignored anything that's not going to support his narrative? He goes on to vaguely cite some random interview where somebody said that they had no evidence against Daniel and Malaya at that point. Doesn't actually say what the interview is, who the interview was with, or even when this occurred. Now, as you know, I have covered this case from day one. I have covered every single interview. I've covered every media release. I've covered the documents. I've covered every news story that has come out with anything new. Only recently I added to my case file playlist every single video that's been put out by the major news outlets. And yes, I watched every single one as I was screen recording it. But I cannot, for the life of me, think of an instance where someone has come forward and said, we have no evidence against Daniel or Malaya. To me, what's happening here is that he's claiming this random interview, but not producing the receipts, and hoping that his audience will believe that him just saying that this random interview exists is enough of a receipt. And then he shares this comment from one of his viewers. Well, if one of them did something, then they're all in it, or they all did. So, like, they should be running to the RCMP to pin the blame and get immunity. It's a little bit more complicated than that. There are so many different things at play here. First of all, you have a mathematician who believes that he has outsmarted everybody, who believes that his stories are so fantastic that they've got to convince people, who believes that Lily and Jack won't be found. And I'm sure in his head, he believes that if they can't find Lily and Jack, they can't prosecute anyone. You have his mother, who would never flip on her son in a million years. Now, both of them, with the help of Darren Geddes, have been working very hard for the last 8 months to try and push the focus onto Malaya. But the thing is, they've not been successful in doing so, because clearly she's not the key player here. If Malaya was solely responsible, they would have dobbed her in by now. And what he's saying here is, well, if one of them did it, all of them did it. You have a woman who has been abused, who has been in a not so great domestic situation. A woman who has never learned her entire life to act like an adult or take responsibility for anything. But on top of that, you have a situation where she's been in a relationship where there has been coercive control. You've heard flat out all the comments about how Daniel's the one that could discipline the kids. Malaya had no control over them. That comes from someone gradually eroding her confidence over 2-3 years to the point that she believed that she was incompetent as a parent. Whatever happened to these children, you can bet that they told her, it's your fault because you never taught these kids discipline. And this has happened because of you. They will have done the typical thing and flipped it back onto her, made her feel that it was her fault, made her believe it was her fault. So she would stay silent over that. But not only that, we've seen enough things to show us that Daniel's got Malaya scared. Maybe there is an order against him right now and he's not allowed to go near her, and I believe that probably is the case. But it's the little things. It's the coming up behind her in the car park and putting her mail in the trunk of her vehicle. That was designed to intimidate. He's trying to make it sound like it's an innocent thing. That is designed to intimidate. Parking directly next to her car, that is designed to intimidate. Saying that he holds back when he goes to his appointments to see Meadow because he doesn't want to run into her when he's going through the door. BS. That sounds to me like he was intentionally making sure he was going in the door as she was coming out. And that is an intimidation tactic. You heard from the girl who was his girlfriend for a while, where he was threatening her with CPS for her children. He was going to report her to CPS. We heard Durwood's story, and I did a video on that a while ago where I pulled all the threads together and showed that in actual fact what happened was that this all occurred the day before Daniel's court appearance to try and get access to Meadow, and it was orchestrated between him and Durwood to make Malaya lose custody of Meadow. And they did that by, first of all, somehow getting Cindy out of the house. Durwood contacts Daniel and says Malaya's unsupervised. Daniel rings Malaya. He claims she was already driving when he rang her. I believe he contacted her before then, or Hayden contacted her and said, hey, Daniel's on his way. Daniel rang her just to nail it in. She heads off to her father's house. Daniel reports her. I don't believe it was Cindy, and I've spoken about that too. Meadow gets taken. I have no doubt that threats have been made towards Malaya, that if she speaks up, she's never going to get custody of Meadow again, that Daniel's family is going to make sure that happens. I have no doubt that there is intimidation going on, so that even if she is partly culpable, Malaya's not going to do any deal with the RCMP. Firstly, because she's never learnt how to take responsibility for anything, but secondly, because she is afraid to speak up. She's been made to feel guilty by the people on that property. She's probably been made to feel that it is her fault. Whatever happened to Lily and Jack is her fault because of her failings as a mother. But not only that, she's been made to fear that there will be retribution if she says anything. She's lying to her own family. So why would she consider coming forward and telling the truth to the RCMP? And then he goes on with this whole story of, well, you know, they normally try and separate suspects so they don't have the same story. But they separated themselves. Has he even paid attention to what Malaya and Daniel said at the beginning of this case? Because they were telling the same story. They did make up the same story. And the problem was, because they made up the story together, they got their roles confused. So you had Daniel and Malaya both being the first one to wake up and the other person was still asleep, because they didn't quite get things straight. You have Malaya saying she immediately rang 911, while Daniel apparently, on one hand, ran up a hill and ran back down and ran around the house and hopped in the car and drove around everywhere, and another time he drove around everywhere and then came back and went running through the woods like some superhero. So, before Malaya left, they'd already worked out their stories. Now, this comment that, well, they normally try and separate suspects. By law, they can't separate their suspects unless they're about to make an arrest. They can put them in separate interrogation rooms and ask them questions, but they can't prevent them from being together unless they're making an arrest. So this whole thing of, normally they'd separate suspects, but these two separated themselves. There's no logic in that whatsoever. I'm not even sure what his point is there. If he's trying to say that, well, Malaya left, so the fact that their stories match can't be because they came up with the story together, because she left. Well, she didn't leave till the Saturday. And since it seems quite clear that whatever happened on the Thursday evening, that's plenty of time for them to work out their stories. So it seems like his main argument here is that it couldn't possibly be a criminal case, because what's happened since documents came out in August? Except he doesn't know when they came out and thinks they came out in July. It's like, what new things could they have? They're not going to tell us what they have. And I've already explained that a lot of the forensics wouldn't have been back at the time that those records access requests were being made. They've done so many more interviews since then. So much can happen in 6 months. But his big bold claim is, once you have your suspect in mind, it's not hard, especially if it's close to the time of the crime. So it seems like his main argument here is that, well, look, we saw in the documents that they had all these investigative things going on. So surely the arrest should have happened months ago, because they interviewed all these people months ago. He doesn't seem to understand the complexity of these kind of cases. He doesn't seem to understand that before you make an arrest, you need to make sure this case is rock solid, so that arrest holds and you actually get a conviction. This notion that, well, they interviewed CPS and the teacher and all these other people way back before these documents came out, so surely that would mean that they must have been ready to make an arrest if there was a case there, because they've already done all these interviews. So you arrest someone and you go to court and say, well, here's all the evidence we've got. We've got a CPS report, so we believe, because there's a CPS report on these children, that this person is responsible for their death. No, we don't have their remains. No, we don't have the rest of the records. And yeah, we haven't interviewed a lot of people. They'd be laughed out of court. Currently, this is a nobody case. When you have a nobody case, you need to have a mountain of circumstantial evidence, because you've got to convince a jury without an autopsy report. So when it comes to nobody cases, they do take time. Unless, of course, you have some fool that claims they were hit over the head in the car park and their child was abducted in a public car park in the middle of town. Because obviously something like that is really easy to get a mountain of circumstantial evidence immediately and therefore make an arrest. But for the most part, when it comes to nobody cases, it's a long haul. So let's talk about it. Okay, Michael Vaughan, aka Monkey. He was 5 in July of 2021. His father was meant to be watching him. He got out through a door that was not locked, wandered out through the side gate and wandered out onto the street, took himself for a wander. He was known to do this, but his parents hadn't actually gotten around to fixing the faulty lock to stop him from getting out and going wandering down the street. And he went missing. There was no sign of him. In 2022, a guy named Stacey Wandra and his ex-wife, Sarah, were named as suspects. They believed that they had abducted Michael. However, they went in, they turned the house upside down, they searched the yard, they didn't find any sign of Michael. They did take a bunch of stuff out, which was evidence. But at that point in time, no charges were laid. So they knew in 2022 that Stacey Wandra was responsible for whatever happened to Monkey. But they didn't arrest him in 2022. It wasn't until this 31st of October just gone, 2025. So we're talking over 4 years later, 4 years and 3 months later, they finally announced that they had arrested Stacey Wandra. He's charged with first degree, the M word, second degree kidnapping, and destruction of evidence. They've said that there are 2 other persons of interest, but those arrests have not been made. So 4 years, 3 months later, we finally have an arrest on this case, even though they had their suspects the year after he went missing. Now, I did a video last week where I was doing a comparison between interviews done by Malaya and Daniel and interviews done by Trezell and Jacqueline West. These were the adoptive parents of Classic and Sincere, also known as Oren and Orson West, because after they adopted them, they renamed them. In December 2021, Classic and Sincere were reported missing by these lowlifes. They'd actually been gone for much longer than that. I won't go too much into this case, but basically they adopted them for money. There's some sort of payout that you get when you adopt. They got the money, they disposed of the children. Obviously, law enforcement had their sights on them, but again, no body case. They still haven't found these boys. So Trezell and Jacqueline were arrested in March of 2022. That's 15 months after they reported these boys missing. 15 months to put together a rock-solid case to make sure that there was justice for these 2 little boys. This one is possibly one of the most heartbreaking cases out there. This is Harmony Montgomery. Harmony was 5 when her father, Adam Montgomery, took her life. This poor little girl had the most wretched life. Adam was in prison when she was born. Her mother, Crystal Sorey, was like Daniel, that sort of loser. So in 2018, when Harmony was 4, she lost custody of Harmony because of rugs. And Harmony was put into the foster care system. For some reason, in February of 2019, some genius somewhere decided that it would be totally fine for Adam to have custody of Harmony. Now, for some reason, they clearly didn't keep an eye on what was going on, because in December of 2019, Adam Montgomery, his wife, Kayla Montgomery, and Harmony were living out of a vehicle. And he basically lost his shiz because Harmony peed herself in the vehicle. And he assaulted her and it ended her life. They didn't report her missing. It was 2.5 years later that her mother, Crystal, reported her missing. So that was November 2021 that Harmony was reported missing. Immediately, Adam Montgomery was a suspect. And Kayla actually told them what he did. But it was 11 months before he was arrested. He was arrested on the 22nd of January 2022. But those charges at that time weren't for her death. They were second-degree assault, felony second-degree assault, interference with custody, and 2 charges of endangering welfare. It was not until October of 2022 that he was charged with the big M word. They knew from day one that he was the one responsible for what happened to Harmony. But they built a case. They didn't have Harmony's remains, and Harmony still has not been found. So they worked on building that case. It took them 11 months, but they got an arrest and they got a conviction. Dee Warner, April 25th, 2021, she was reported missing by her husband Dale. He believed that she had just gone off to live on a tropical island somewhere. Apparently she took her hairdryer, but that's about all she took. Coincidentally, at the time of her apparent departure, their daughter, who was I think 5 at the time, was at a friend of Dee's place because Dee had said to her friend, I'm going to end it with Dale. I'm ending my marriage. I'm telling him it's over. And I don't want our daughter to witness that. So her friend took her daughter. And next thing we know, Dee is missing. It seemed pretty clear what had happened. And of course, Dale was number 1 suspect. But it took 2 years and 7 months before he was finally arrested. At the time, that was a nobody case. That was November 2023. It was August of 2024 that Dee's remains were found. He had sealed her remains in an empty tank on his property, welded it shut. Of course, what he didn't realise was that way he had basically preserved all the evidence, meaning that now the case against him is rock solid. But his arrest was made before her remains were found. But that took 2 years and 7 months because they wanted to have a rock solid case. And the final one that I want to discuss is Suzanne Morphew, and this one is significant. Suzanne was reported missing on the 10th of May 2020. Straight away, authorities were onto her husband Barry. Things just did not add up at all. Barry claimed that he'd left early in the morning to go to a job a few hours away on that Sunday morning, and that when he left, Suzanne was going to go for a bike ride, even though she never went for bike rides in the morning. Usually it was afternoons when she went for bike rides. Barry's story kept changing anytime he got caught out in lies, which, sounds a bit familiar, right? And there were so many things that didn't add up. Just for starters, Suzanne's bike was found at the bottom of a very steep hill off a road that she never went on when she went bike riding. And the thing is, there was no damage to that bike, and the handbrake was on. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details here because I am going to do a thorough video on this before Barry goes to trial, because I will be following his trial, so I will be sharing it with you. But basically, they had him pegged from day one as being the suspect. 12 months later, they made an arrest. So, May 10th, 2020, Suzanne was reported missing. May 5th, 2021, Barry was arrested. However, on the 19th of April, 2022, so 11 months after his arrest, the case was dismissed without prejudice by the judge. This was a motion that had been put forward by the prosecution because they felt that they did not have a strong enough case at the time. Their argument was, we're hoping that we will find remains and that will give us a stronger case. So the case was dismissed because they had leapt in too quickly. They didn't have a strong enough case. And the way it was headed, he was going to get off. And of course, once someone gets off, double jeopardy kicks in. You can't charge them again for the same crime. This case is something that I'm sure law enforcement all around paid attention to. This is what happens when you jump in too soon and make an arrest without having that rock solid case. Now, Barry was arrested in June of last year, June 2025, 5 years and 1 month after Suzanne's disappearance. The difference here is that her remains were actually found in September of 2023. But then even if you look at it that way, that is still, even with remains, that's almost 2 years from when they found her remains to when they finally arrested Barry. So this notion that if it was a criminal case they would have made an arrest by now is way off. Now, some of the cases that I just mentioned don't exactly align with Lily and Jack's case because there are different sorts of variables there. Dee Warner, Suzanne Morphew, that's not a familial custody kind of thing. These are grown women whose husbands were saying they had ran off and were living somewhere else. Michael Vaughan was a non-familial abduction. Those sorts of cases take longer to put together because you are not looking at a familial custodial kind of situation where the first people you look at are the parents, and usually you can start putting a case together pretty quickly. So if we look at Harmony's case, that was 11 months. Classic and Sincere, that was 15 months. And in both those cases, they had their suspects pretty much from day one. But it took time to put the case together, to put together a rock-solid case so that when it went to court, they were guaranteed of a conviction, or as guaranteed as you can be when you have a jury making the decision. So this illustrates exactly what Rob McCammon was saying. He said, intensive major crime investigations take time. They have to do it by the book. They've got to get everything right so that the charges stick, so that a conviction is achieved. Saying that the absence of any sort of arrests at this point in time proves that the children actually did wander off into the woods and just haven't been found yet is utterly absurd. All we have to do is listen to what we were actually told here in this article. Not only that, but we just need to look at other cases and see the sort of time frame that we are looking at. Now, I believe that we're going to see justice this year for Lily and Jack. Whether it's in a month's time, whether it's in 6 months' time, I can't tell you because I'm not privy to the investigation. But that article fills me with hope. And if you want a proper interpretation of that article, there is a video that I've done about that article where I'm not claiming that the article proves the children must have just wandered off. Rob McCammon has mentioned before how heavily invested the staff are in this case. I have no doubt that the Major Crimes Unit is going to make sure that they are thoroughly crossing their T's and dotting their I's before they even consider making an arrest. Because just like the rest of us, they want to see justice served. And having an arrest isn't justice being served. That's only part of the process. Justice is served when a conviction is recorded. So hopefully this video has provided more clarification for people. Hopefully it has put a few fears to rest. We just need to be patient, and it is hard because we are not privy to what's going on in the background. But I really feel confident after that article came out that we are going to see justice for Lily and Jack. So that brings us to the end of this video. I know these 3 videos were supposed to be short videos, but this one turned out to have a lot of different things that I needed to talk about. So it ended up twice as long as what I expected it to be. But, you know, that happens. So thanks for listening. If you're new to my channel, please subscribe. Also, please hit the like button so this video gets out there into the algorithm. And please leave a comment below. Thank you, and I will catch you in the next one.